Okay, let's dive right in because we've got folks here and time goes by very quickly. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, um, it's a tremendous pleasure again to introduce our second art session at Waterbirds. And I was thinking how much fun it's been to have this sort of an element added on to our regular programs. And one of the real benefits of being online is we can draw in people from different parts of the country, and also it's easier to draw in different sorts of programmatic features that might be harder to do if we were all together somewhere. So tonight we've got Lindsay Nielsen, and Lindsay's in her native territory, Montana. She left there for a while to come to College of the Atlantic, and she sort of split her heart three ways between whales and birds and art, and decided she wasn't going to give up any of them. And so she worked at our field station on Mount Desert Rock, and she also, I might add, has a tremendous hand with carpentry. So she helped put that field station back together again after we got totally washed over by a storm. She worked on Great Duck and was really interested in questions of tameness in gulls between the two stations. And then for her senior thesis, she did a perfectly lovely book, which was a combination of looking at sibling relationships in the gulls on the islands and also painting and drawing the islands and the birds and marine mammals of the islands. After that, she got a job working with a succession of cruise companies. So she's got to go all over the world doing art and science as part of guiding different groups of people from Antarctica to the Baja to the Northwest Passage. My personal favorite, Lindsay, was when she called me to say that she had to go on a cruise gig to the Antarctic Peninsula and had been instructed to make sure that she packed a ball dress, which did not seem like the sort of thing that Shackleton would have taken with him down in Endurance. But COVID has put her on shore for a bit, and so I was able to convince her to come and work with us tonight. And so without further ado, Lindsay Nielsen and Scratchboards, feathers, and who knows what.
Who knows what. That sounds good. So thank you all for coming. I see that some of you already have some Scratchboard out. If you don't have Scratchboard, that's totally fine. Just feel free to watch along or follow along, and maybe it's something that you want to try in the future. Just bear with me a second. I'm going to try to set up my little device here so you can actually see what I'm doing. Rachel, can you help me? Let's snap this thing together. Cool, I'm already there. Right. Good deal. So I'm assuming that a lot of folks hadn't heard of Scratchboard. I know that I had never heard of it before until I went to College of the Atlantic and I took an art class, and it just so happened that it was something that was brought into the room and I fell in love with it. I thought it was a really unique medium and it really lends itself well to texture. So I just brought a quick example of what a pretty simple Scratchboard piece would look like. So essentially what you're doing is that you have this hard clay board, this black board, and what it is it's a piece of wood that's covered in a thin layer of white clay that's then hot pressed onto this board. And on top of that, it's then layered again with black India ink. And so essentially what you're doing when you're working with Scratchboard is that you're pulling pigment away from the board. So in essence, you're kind of drawing in reverse. So instead of when you're usually drawing, you're focusing on shadows, you're focusing on the dark places. And with Scratchboard, you're focusing on light. And I really like that concept a lot, of that we see things because of light. And so with this, we're being forced to focus on the light instead of the darkness when you're drawing on Scratchboard. And so some kind of equipment and tools that I tend to use. This is my favorite board. If you're looking to dive into this a little bit deeper, you can also get Scratchboard paper, which also works out really well. But I tend to use the ampersand museum quality panels. They'll last forever and they're really good and sturdy. And you don't have to frame them or anything when you're done. You just can spray them with a with basically a final matte glaze, and it will preserve for forever. They're pretty hardy, which is also great if you're planning on traveling or anything else like that. And so what I would suggest doing when you're first kind of starting out with Scratchboard is to play around a little bit with your tools. And so I just brought an assortment of the tools that I like to use. This is just your basic Scratchboard tool. Oftentimes if you get a kit, it's going to come with something like this. But pretty much anything that has a sharpest edge will work out just fine. So I tend to use an X-Acto knife, one of these, and then you can also play around with a variety of other things from sandpaper to anything else that can pull away the pigment. So this is just a little abrasive brush that you can use, and if you kind of see, it takes a few layers, but it will give you a nice kind of pulled away quality. So when you're looking at shading or fur, this is a really nice tool to be able to use. And I always bring a rag along with me as well, because as you can see, the pigment can kind of rub off and get all over your hands otherwise. But before you begin with your Scratchboard at all, I would suggest kind of starting out playing with your tools a little bit and seeing just how they work on the Scratchboard. So for instance, with this one, you have the very sharp end tip, and that's going to give you these really nice fine lines, right? And then if you turn it on its side, you can pull away these larger swaths of pigment. So maybe just take a little corner of your Scratchboard and play around a little bit with the different sides of your tool, whatever your tool might be, and just kind of see how much pressure you need to pull off that pigment. Because you don't need to put a ton on, but if you want, you can really dig into it. You're not going to actually go through the whole white layer and hit the board underneath. It's pretty sturdy stuff. You'd have to dig for a long, long time to hit the board underneath. So you can see you get a really good range of gradient when you're playing around with these different sides. But that's something that that is really interesting about Scratchboard compared to using pencil or another tool, is that you are working strictly in black and white. There's not a gray area. And so when you're thinking about creating shading, instead you have to think more about the space between your lines. So either very close lines, that's going to give you a nice highlighted area, versus if you let your lines kind of taper off, that's going to allow the gradient to kind of get darker as you go. You can also do a variety of different things like cross hatching, where you're basically taking lines in one direction and then you come across them again in another direction. So you can see you can create a whole variety of textures and gradients just by playing around with different ways of using your tools and different forms of bringing your lines together. Okay, so after you've kind of got a little bit of sense of how to use your tools with your Scratchboard, then we can start looking at our feathers. So hopefully all of you brought a feather with you. I'm just going to use this one here. And so the first thing that I would do before even starting on your Scratchboard, because again, Scratchboard can be a kind of unforgiving medium. You can't erase a line. You can draw over it with a black pen or whatever else, but you can't go back and cover it up completely because it is a carving. So you'll still be able to feel that divot that you made with your tool. And so before starting, I'll do a preliminary sketch. And so if you have a bit of scratch paper around, or you can draw directly on your Scratchboard, that's fine too. Pencil will come off of Scratchboard plenty easily, but I like to use just a spare sheet of paper and do a quick sketch of your feather. And so I generally will start at the base. And for those of you that were at Anna Stunkel's drawing class yesterday, which was awesome, she showed you the technique of using your pencil as a measuring tool. And I'll do that a lot, where I just kind of check myself. But it's nice when you have a feather there, or any object that's pretty close to your paper. It's pretty easy to draw it to scale.
Linz, can you make your screen larger? I think if you go to speaker mode, it might open up your screen larger.
Let me push some buttons. Switch
think,
to, is that it?
I think if the participants select speaker under view, her screen should be the largest.
Okay. Did that do anything, John, when I switched to speaker mode?
I see your board is much bigger now. How about other people? Yes,
I think
no?
we all need to do it for ourselves.
Yeah, I think you each need to do it yourselves.
Okay.
So up at the view in the top right hand, you can choose speaker instead of gallery.
Yes, that's what I did, and it shows perfectly when Lacey talks.
Oh, but then when one of us talks, it's not so good.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
Lindsay-
when someone else talk, then it will pop up the screen of the person who is talking.
So if you go to the three dots in the upper right of Lindsay's rectangle and click on that and click pin video, it will stay on hers.
Brilliant, Anna.
Right. Thanks, Anna.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, cool. Perfect. Now that we're back on track there, we can continue. And again, just kind of do a quick sketch. I'm not going to focus on any detail when I'm doing an initial sketch of my feather. It's really kind of going to be more of a gestural thing. It's just laying out kind of the main features of the feather drawing. So again, I might take a measurement, see the depth. And I point out, so if there are any variations in the feather, so you see on mine, there's this nice little gap, or if there's any curves or areas of overlap, those are areas that I'm gonna just kind of guide out for myself, because those will be really interesting to play with once you get it on the Scratchboard itself. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just kind of to give yourself a guide for when you're going with your Scratchboard. All right. And mine has some color variation, so I might just very lightly pencil that in. But again, not really focusing on the detail, just giving me a sense of where those areas are. Because those are things that we can focus a little bit more closely on once we're actually working on the Scratchboard itself. All right. So now that I kind of have my basic outline of the feather that I'm going to want to draw, the next step, and this might be, there's better ways to do this, but this way works just completely fine for me, is that you're going to want to transfer this image onto your Scratchboard. And the easiest way to do that is to actually turn your piece of paper over that you did your sketch on, and you're going to go ahead with your pencil and you're just going to color behind it. So make sure that it lines up with where you drew your image. So if you hold it up to the light, you can often see through the paper and see where your image is. And then if you just go and color that whole space in, this is going to allow us to then transfer this image onto our Scratchboard without actually having to work sketching on the Scratchboard itself. So make sure you've got it colored in really nice and evenly all the way through. All right. Once you have this step complete, you have your feather drawing there, then you can go ahead and you can work on transferring the image over. And basically all that is that you can line up your sketch however you want it to be oriented on your board. I like it to be centered, and I'm going to go back over it with my pencil, and I'm going to push a bit harder to give it plenty of pressure. And I'm going to just trace over the area that I sketched out with my pencil. And this is going to cause the graphite that I basically scribbled all over the place on the other side to transfer onto the scratch board. And again, you don't have to keep too much detail. It's just going to kind of give us some guidelines to play with once we're actually working on the board itself. All right. And so you can see it's very light. I'm not sure if you can actually see it on my board, but if you get it to catch the light, all right. Yeah, you can see that light outline of the feather where that graphite transferred through. And so that's going to help us kind of know where to start when we're actually using our tools on the scratch board. And so now that we're there, I'm going to keep my reference feather handy just so it's nice and close. And when I'm starting with the scratch board, I'm going to start at the very end of the quill. We'll just do the first line that goes up the feather. And you can lighten it up a little bit. Again, kind of look where the highlights are on your feather. And you can run those lines over a couple times. Feathers were actually the first subject that I used with Scratchboard. So it's really fun to kind of go back and revisit this a little bit. One thing that Scratchboard is really good at is capturing texture. So anything tactile that you might want to reach out and touch is something that Scratchboard is really, really good at capturing. So fur, feathers, mosses, anything that has a really unique texture is going to be really nice for Scratchboard. And so to just kind of give it that little rounded shape of the quill, I'm just bringing my tool in like slight circular patterns, tapering away from that initial highlighted area. So now that I have kind of this guide of this initial line, I'm gonna actually start at the very top of my feather, so where it would first emerge from the bird. And I'm gonna start doing the small lines and paying attention to how each of these actually attach to the feather. And one thing I would say with here is never to outline the feather. It's tempting to go and follow all your guidelines that you initially drew, but that would actually give it a pretty cartoonish quality. So you want to just use those as guides to show you where to start your initial scratch as you're pulling it back toward the main shaft of the feather. And you can see with my feather, I hit an area of pigment pretty early. And so in order to kind of bring that out, I'm going to go back over that area of white a few times and kind of leave that darker area alone. So I'll do an initial layer, just kind of laying out the lines going right to the feather. And pay attention to how they curve as well. So you really want to, in order to give it that really realistic quality, you want to be very conscientious of the shape of the feather and the shape of each of the lines that's coming back to the main shaft of the feather. And so again, in order to bring out those highlights, I'm going to go ahead and go over that area a couple more times. Just to make that a bit more prominent. And again, remember to wipe off your board every now and then, because that pigment will kind of layer up on top, so it's hard to get a sense of how light you've made something until you do that. Perfect. And so it's a lot of really repetitive motion, especially with something that has a pretty even texture, like a feather. So we're going to be moving just slowly down the shaft of the feather. And I can see already on mine, there's a slight area where there's an overlap of where part of the feather comes over and overlays part of the other. So I'm actually going to go ahead and do that overlay part first before going back to that area that was that's in behind it, just so I make sure that that's a little bit more prominent. And then going back and continuing to fill in that area where it's overlapped behind. And so once you have kind of your initial outline, it's pretty darn easy to just kind of go through and continue to layer and reference back to your feather as much as you can. I'd say the more time, you want to spend more time looking at your feather than looking at your board. I think we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about what we're drawing rather than actually looking at what we're drawing. So it's a good practice to constantly be going back and forth, always checking your details with the actual feather. And so keeping it nice and close is a really good way to do that. There we go. I might start kind of coming over on the other side a little bit. And you'll notice that if you start holding your tool in a different way, so like I just switched the orientation, I was holding my tool, you'll see that it starts scratching in different qualities. So that's just something to be aware of as you're going through and using your tool, is that any angle difference of you holding it is going to change how it pulls away that pigment. Well, it's a fun exercise. It's always neat to kind of go and look at some Scratchboard artists. So there is a Scratchboard Artist Society, and you'll notice that all artists have really different techniques. I mean, with any medium, that's true, but there's a lot of different really cool experimental stuff you can do with Scratchboard. So for instance, with these areas that I've pulled the black pigment away, if I wanted to, I could actually go back and add in pigment. So if I had watercolor or any kind of water-based paint, even acrylics like that were watered down, you can go back and add the pigment in. And so you can really play around with that as well. And with the adding of the pigment, you can also go back and scratch out the pigment as well. So you can really start to get some really interesting pieces and a wide variety of pieces as you play around with both color and the texture of the Scratchboard. Good deal. How's everyone going so far? They're all mostly muted. Yeah.
Can I ask a question while you're drawing?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm finding this a sort of a brain challenge to flip the colors. And I'm looking at like the vein, which you drew first of the feather.
Mm-hmm.
And you weren't concerned about the fact that that vein goes through light and dark.
I was not. And so one thing that I'll do to correct that, because right now the vein for me is mostly going to be that, again, that guideline. And once I get a little further along, I'll be able to bring in a micron pen, or even just kind of smudging the board a little bit. We'll be able to bring the darkness back. So you can see I can actually pull that back in there. But mostly I'll use a micron pen, and then I'll bring that back in, because no matter what, this line is going to be there. But you're right. You can see kind of these areas here where it's actually going to be darker. And so those are areas where I'll go back in with a micron pen and draw that in. But for me, just having that initial guideline is pretty useful just to bring it back. But if I'm going for complete accuracy, yeah, there will be areas that I'll try to go back and darken back up again. And with this kind of scratch board, I'll even just bring a brush, just a regular little paintbrush, and dab it in water, and then just wipe it over the top of it. And that's going to take the pigment that already exists on the board, because this is a water-based pigment. And then it's going to allow it to smear kind of over those areas. But it will still, this line will still exist as a carved out area. So you'll still be able to feel it. But that's something that I would want anyway, because this is something that's consistent on the feather as well.
Right, right.
That's a really good question. So there's a lot of, again, that goes with the coloring as well. You can move back and forth with your pigment a lot. You just can't uncarve once you've carved. And so you'll still be able to run your fingers over and feel that something's there, that you've still made that carving. But you can change the pigment by going back with either a brush or with a pen.
I just have to say, this is so much fun. And it is kind of weird to think backwards, like with the light and dark. But as someone who really likes, doing really textured drawing, it's super fun.
Yeah, it's cool.
I've never tried it before, and now I want to get more Scratchboard.
Oh, and I feel like you're going to be so good at Scratchboard. You've already got such amazing detail in your colored pencil drawings. I'm going to pick it up like that.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Sure. Yeah, thank you all for coming. I mean, at this point, it's a pretty kind of repetitive process once you're getting going with it. But a couple things that I will point out. So I'm just going to kind of skip down on my feather a little bit to this area here where you have this little cut in the line. And again, here it's pretty easy to just keep going with these straight lines because the feather's all together. But here we do end up having an area where we're going to have to curve these lines a little bit. And there's actually, from my perspective, I can see there's a little bit of overlap. And so again, just really, really taking that time to make sure that your lines are moving together really nicely and pulling out those highlights. So variation in the pressure that you're putting on your carving tool, and also the direction of the lines are really going to help create that differential in light, because we're really working with contrast with Scratchboard. And oftentimes the more contrasted something is, the more impactful it looks, I suppose. So you can exaggerate that a little bit when you're looking at your feather and really trying to pull out the spots where the light is hitting it, just to give it that sense of movement. And I find too with Scratchboard that in some ways it's less intimidating to me than having a white piece of paper, because sometimes you have this big white piece of paper in front of you and it's hard to know where to begin. But with Scratchboard, I feel like you just kind of let the image emerge a little bit. It feels like you're uncovering it as you're going through and pulling away the pigment. And because Scratchboard can be so tedious and so time consuming, especially if you're really, really focusing in on those details, I'll often jump around quite a bit on my subject. So moving from one place to another so I don't get too consumed or wrapped up in one area. Helps keep it interesting.
Lindsay, Damaris asked a question in the chat, which says, I have a question. Will the tools, do you buy the tools in the Scratchboard separately, or can you find them packaged?
You can find them packaged. So I will often go to Blick Art Materials. You can find them on Amazon as well. And you can either get them as a set. I find that more often they sell the paper Scratchboard with the tools as a set, and with the board, like these hard boards, you have to buy the set separately. But with the set of tools, they'll often give you a couple of these tools. They'll also give you kind of this little gradient tool and some other more heavy-heeled brush tools that kind of just give automatic texture. I don't really tend to use those that often. These are kind of my two main tools, but also just a plain X-Acto pen works out great. So this is an X-Acto knife that I like a lot, just basically because you can click the sharp end in, and so you don't have a bunch of sharps just hanging around. So versus this kind of X-Acto knife where if you leave it out, it's pretty easy to accidentally cut yourself, which I've done several times. So I tend to like this guy a lot. And the great thing about X-Acto knives is you can really get the detail. The lines will be very, very thin. And so especially on areas like that are dark on the feather, where I still want to show that there is lines that are going through there, an X-Acto knife is really great for that, because it's going to let you do these very, very light lines throughout the feather. Versus some of these bigger tools, they tend to give more heavy-handed lines.
I know you've done a lot of drawing in the field. Do you use Scratchboard in the field too, or is it a trickier thing to eyeball?
It can be trickier. I tend to do a lot of sketching in the field and then bringing them back. Unless I have something like a feather or a pine cone or a chunk of moss or bark, I love being able to work from life when I can. And so bringing those kind of things into whatever space that I'm using for drawing is ideal. But if I'm doing an animal subject, I tend to spend a lot of time in the field sketching it initially, just with pencil and paper, and then coming back and working on that sketch for a while, and then doing the same thing that I showed you here, where I transferred the image onto the Scratchboard piece using just the simple technique of coloring the back of it and then drawing it back on the board and then working from there. But the thing with Scratchboard is you can get very, very detail oriented with Scratchboard if that's something that you want. And in those cases, having photos as references can be really helpful, or having feathers or bits of the subject that you're doing can be really, really useful, because that's going to allow you to focus on the really, really fine details of something that you might not be able to see in person or even in a photograph. So being able to really look at a feather and look at how it's put together. If I were to spend a lot more time on this, you could really, really get into a lot of nitty-gritty details with how the feather is put together, and you could spend a lot of time on it. So it's nice to have at least some reference, whether it's a swath of fur or a feather or anything else from the environment that you're drawing, to really be able to bring out those details in a good way. So it's great. So I'll let everyone kind of work on their feathers for a little bit longer. But I know that after a little while with Scratchboard, it is pretty repetitive. We're not going to be doing too many new things with it. So I do want to introduce everyone to a medium that I love bringing in the field, and that I can't show you in its completeness here because we do need sunshine for it. but it's a really, really fun one to play with. And so we'll just give our feathers a couple more minutes. If you guys have any more questions about Scratchboard in general, about the tools, about best places to use it, feel free to shout out or write into the chat box and Kate can relay it to me. And otherwise we'll move on really quickly to cyanotype.
Anna did ask if you have any advice for the fluffy textured areas near the base of the feather.
For the fluffy textured areas, that's a really good question. So looking at my little fluffy textured areas, you can either take your sharpest edge that you have and just very, very lightly go over where those are, and paying attention to some of them are a little spindly, move around a little bit. Or you could even take this tool, which again is just kind of pretty similar to steel wool, and you can really lightly go over the top, and that's going to kind of give it this, you add pressure closer to the shaft of the feather and pull it out, it will allow it to degrade a little bit, and then you can go in with your sharp edge and give any definition into that fluff or that downy area of the feather that you want. So there's a lot of layering options that you can do by playing around with those different tools. And around the shaft of the feather, I might do some cross hatching, because unlike with the feather itself, where you do have these very distinctive lines that are moving up the feather, you do have areas of higher light and lower light, and I might just cross hatch back and forth to really bring out those highlights and give it a little bit more of that texture. So again, it's just a lot of play. And having a section of your board where you can kind of go back to and play with different things like scribblings or different forms of cross-hatching, just to kind of see what it looks like and what sort of texture you're really going for is going to be super helpful for you. Go. How's everyone going on their feathers?
I don't want you to feel like you're out there hanging. I teach enough classes to know that sometimes you need to hear a voice and see a face. It's great.
Oh, good. Let's see them. That's awesome. So I think at this point, so now I feel like you probably have the general idea of where to go with your Scratchboard. And again, you could spend as many or few hours on this as you wanted, just to get as much or as little detail as you are really shooting for. But I do want to, well, we still have a decent amount of time, and I know we have about 20 minutes left. I know it is getting late for some of you folks that are on the East Coast, especially. I did want to introduce you all to one other technique that is really conducive in the field. So I do bring Scratchboard in the field. It is really portable. It's great. But again, as you've noticed, it does take a lot of time, and it can is not always good for moving objects. And sometimes you just want to get an impression of an object and move on. And there are plenty of feathers out there, as well as other objects that you are either not allowed to collect, or maybe you don't really want to bring home. And so for a lot of those things, I like to use cyanotype. And another word for cyanotype, I'm just going to move my Scratchboard tools and things out of the way a little bit, is called sun printing. And so this was developed in the 1800s. It was actually developed by a woman named Anna Atkins, and it's basically the precursor to photography, which is pretty fun. And so essentially what you do is you can get your cyanotype kit, and it's a pretty easy mixture where it's a 1-to-1 ratio of part A and part B. You're going to mix it together, and you're going to go ahead and you'll paint it right on your piece of paper. And I'll often use a thicker piece of paper. Watercolor paper in particular works really, really well with cyanotype. And it will come off as being a greenish color once you have it painted. And you're gonna wanna do that in a dark place, and then you're gonna put it away. And then after it's dried, you can take it out in the field. And again, you wanna keep it in a place, either a folder or in a notebook where it's not gonna see the sunlight. And then once it's out in the field, you can go ahead and you can lay an object on the scratchboard, or not on the scratchboard, sorry, on the cyanotype. And you're gonna leave it there in the sunshine for maybe 10, 20 minutes. And then you're gonna remove it. And you'll basically have a reverse print of your feather or whatever object that you have. And so then you go ahead and you'll just wash your cyanotype, your piece of paper, with water. And what you're left with is a really beautiful image that you can take with you. And so I love using this wherever I go in the field. A lot of places we're not allowed to take things with us from Antarctica or from the Arctic. We're in a lot of these really beautiful protected areas that have these gorgeous objects that, of course, you want to put in your pockets and take home to add to your cabinets of curiosity. But cyanotype is a really beautiful way to do that without actually taking objects out of the field. So you can basically expose your object in the sunlight, and then you have the image that you can take with you after you wash it with some water. The thing is with this is that you do want to make sure that you're exposing it for the right amount of time. And so this is another technique where you do want to play around with it quite a bit. And so, for instance, this image here was one that I underexposed. So I didn't leave it in the sun for very long, or not long enough. And so once I washed it in water, it came out very faint. And so you can still see some of the details, and it does have a pretty artsy quality to it, but it doesn't have the distinction of the feather that I was really hoping to go for. You can also overexpose it. In Montana in the winter, it's really hard to overexpose anything because we're really fighting for sun as much as we can now. But what that would look like is just a very, very dark blue version where a lot of the detail would be lost. So you're really looking for a happy medium with your exposure time. But again, it's just a fun thing that I wanted to mention because it's a great one to do with kids. It's a great one to do outside. And especially during these times when a lot of us are kind of caught up outside, it's always inside. It's always fun to have projects to get you playing outside. And cyanotype is a great one. And again, you aren't just limited to feathers. You can do it with leaves. You can do it with intertidal objects as well. So it's a whole lot of fun. So I suggest that you give it a try. And it's something that you do want to wear gloves with when you're working with just the part A and part B. Again, all you really need is a cap full of each, and I'll use like a sponge brush, just something really that gives you a nice little even distribution of the liquid to paint onto it, and let it dry and away you go. It's pretty simple. So that's a fun one to get out and do.
And the question, does it work on cloudy days or does it have to be bright sun?
Okay, so Rachel, my roommate, just pointed out there's a question about sunny days versus cloudy days. It's going to work best in the sunny days, but you can do it on a day where there's not high intensity sun. It just means that you have to expose it for a really long time. So upward to 30 to 45 minutes. And if you're doing that, one thing I would suggest that you do is that once you have your object placed on your cyanotype piece of paper, is to put a piece of glass over the top of it, because that will hold the object in place. Because any kind of wind, or even as the sun does move throughout the sky, it creates different shadows on your object. And so if it's flattened using a piece of glass or anything else to kind of hold it flush against the paper, that's going to help a lot if you do need to expose it for a long time because you don't have direct or strong sunlight. So that's a really good question. It's getting harder and harder to do cyanotype here because our daylight is so short and we have had lots of cloud lately. And so this one I did a few days ago and I had to expose it for maybe 20 to 30 minutes. This one I only exposed for 10 minutes, and 10 minutes is fine if you on a bright sunny day. So if you live somewhere down south, if you are in Texas, or when you go to Texas for the next Waterbirds conference, this is going to be something that would be really fun to go out and play with in the desert, is this cyanotype.
Another question, how long can you keep a cyanotype piece of paper in storage after you paint it before exposing it?
All right, so another good question about how long the cyanotype paper keeps. It keeps for a long time. So I've had cyanotype paper that I painted 6 months ago and it still works. So I literally will walk around with a folder full of cyanotype. And again, that folder is kept in a dark place because as soon as the cyanotype is exposed to sunlight, it will start reacting. And once it reacts, then it's kind of done. It's just like film being exposed. And so I'll keep it with me. And as soon as I find something that I find interesting that I want to make a sun print of, I'll kind of lean my shadow over it if I'm outside, or find a tree to hide under and place the object how I want on the piece of paper, and then I'll put it in the sun. But the paper itself, once you've painted the cyanotype liquid on it, will last for a decent amount of time, at least 6 months.
Is it only blue or are there different colors?
So the question is it only blue or is it different colors as well? So it will always be blue. So that cyanotype is actually, cyanotypes also, if you remember, or if I can remember, the like old architectural drawings, those are done with cyanotype. And if you can think of any time you've come across them or seen them, they are blue. They're a blueprint. So this is blueprinting essentially, but brought outside. And you can actually pigment it, and that's called tannining. And so a tannin is going to be, you can use teas, you can use coffee, you can even use wine. And what that will do is that will bind to the chemicals that are in the cyanotype and create a different colored wash. And so that will be either kind of a brownish color, you can get a black color, you can even get kind of a purpley reddish color if you're playing with wine, for instance. And so it's a very fun experimental process of playing with different types of tannins. So again, something that has a higher acid content or acidity content to be able to get different colors. I like the blue a lot, so I tend to stick with the blue, but I also, the wine tannin, a red wine, will also create a really beautiful color as well. And you can do that at any point after you've created the blueprint. So if I was to tannin this, right now I could still do that. So I'd let it dry first, and then I'd go ahead and put it in another colored wash. And so, yeah. Well, I think at this point we're at 6:50 p.m. Or 6:50 my time, so about 10 minutes left for any of you. So at this point, if anyone has questions or has anything else they'd like to add or ask, now is the time to do so. Otherwise, yeah, thank you all so much for attending and playing around with Scratchboard and learning a little bit about cyanotype. I hope you all can get out and try it a little bit. Cool.
Linz, what's your best contact information?
Just my Gmail account, either the COA one or the regular Gmail that I use with you, which is just the lindsay.elaine.nielsen@gmail.com.
Do you think you could stick that up in the chat for right now?
Totally. I think Rachel's on it.
Also, if you could stick your webpage. So participants, just a shout out to both of our teachers the last 2 nights. They both have web pages, and you can see a lot more of their art. And also, you can take some of their art home with you if you feel so inclined. Lynn's just posted the other day a whole collection of Christmas cards with penguins in appropriate Christmas dress. I'm not sure if I can go there, Lindsay.
They're kind of cute.
They're adorable.
Cute. I love the
They're
horses.
so cute. I saw them.
Oh.
So